Let's just ponder on some other elements of this story while we can. Let's speak to Mohamed Hineidi, an expert in radicalism and the director of EMAN, the Extremist Monitoring Analysis Network. Mohamed, thanks so much for your time. Do appreciate it. When we look at that picture of radicalisation, it's one we've seen time and time again, isn't it, sadly? Somebody comes off the rails, enters into a life of petty criminality. Sometimes they go into prison, other times not. But we see that zeal of the convert, especially, it would appear, in this particular case.
Thank you very much, Colin. Yes, you're completely right. Look, ultimately, what the common denominator with many of these lone wolf attacks is that a lot of these people have a history of being radicalized online. Especially in the past couple of years, where people really have plenty of time to read terrorist propaganda and Islamist extremist propaganda, and we've seen that in France. We've seen that in many other parts of the Western world, where lone wolf attacks tend to be quite prevalent now. Before, they were sort of organized attacks by extremist Islamist cells that used to work in unison. Now we see it in France, sort of last year, sort of this year as well. We saw the beheading of an elderly lady outside of a church. By an extremist, and who was drunk as well. So it's it also goes against the principles of Islam. He was high on drugs and he was drunk as well. So it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. This person, this convert specifically, there's a huge problem with many people who convert. They tend to really convert to radicalism. They convert to jihadism, to Islamism. They don't convert to Islam. We're talking about a religion here that's 1,500 years old, one of the greatest religions on the planet with billions of adherents. What this person did yesterday has no connection to what the billions of Muslims across the world, what they were doing with their days yesterday. But there is something wrong. He probably had some grievances towards the state, towards the public, and he probably adopted an ideology that he felt provided him the opportunity to get back to conduct an act of terror against innocent civilians. And this is what it all comes down to. But there is a bigger problem here. And the problem is this: there are Islamist preachers across the world that are responsible for radicalizing vulnerable youth. Now, this person may have had he may have a history of sort of mental issues, etc. It doesn't, however, take away from the fact that there are many radical preachers across the world, especially those in the West, that are very charismatic, that bend scripture and manipulate scripture and distort religious texts to encourage young, vulnerable youth, and he wasn't very young, but just people in general, to commit acts of terror. And this, I think, epitomizes it, really.
It's Mohamed, you're absolutely right to identify that point. I've made it oftentimes, and sadly I've covered a lot of these terror attacks over the years, that there's, I think, a growing determination sometimes for the authorities to say, look, this is a function of a mental illness, that Islamism somehow is a type of mania, a pathology, and it's been medicalized. And actually, as you make very clear, it's in the eyes and the hands of a clever proselytizer. It's what it's always been, which is a coherent ideology, and young, angry men are attracted to coherent ideologies, whether that's Marxism or types of fascism or types of Islamism. But it's not a mental illness.
You're right. You're 100% correct. It is not a mental illness at all. It is an ideology. It is an ideology that needs to be uprooted from root to stem. And this is a problem that the entire world faces. There is a cancer, that is the Islamist ideology. And when I say Islamist ideology, I'm talking about political Islamism. Yeah. And that goes all the way to the end of radical jihadist violence. And that is epitomized by the brutality that we saw when Daesh or ISIS controlled swaths of territories across Iraq and Syria, and now in Afghanistan as well, in eastern Afghanistan. Victims, it doesn't matter who the victims are. They could be 5 innocent people walking, minding their own business in a small town in a country of 5 million in Scandinavia. 30 people were killed last year. 30 people were murdered in Norway. That is a very small number of people. This year, we've had 5 people in one day. In Afghanistan, we had the airport attack. All the victims were local Afghan Muslims. 125 people were blown to bits, including obviously 15 US Marines. We've also had 43 Hazaras killed as well. It is the ideology, and that ideology is the ideology that needs to be combated. It has nothing to do with mental illness, and I think a lot of people oversimplify it when they say mental illness. And the same thing applies, Colin, to other ideologies as well. We have people on the far right that commit acts of, that commit violent acts, and we can't say it's because there is an ideology behind it as well. There are influences that influences people too.
Mohamed, just before you go, we've only got about 45 seconds or so left. But just on, I've had an answer before on more than one occasion from this studio and elsewhere with people who don't like the fact that I say there's no such thing to my mind. I refuse to use the term Islamophobia. I'm certainly very happy to accept that there is anti-Muslim bigotry, but I worry that Islamophobia prescribes discussion, meaningful critical engagement with the topic of Islamism. Do you agree with me?
I agree with you completely. I think the term Islamophobia doesn't make any sense. I mean, Islam is a religion. You can't be against the religion. You can be against the adherents of the religion. Christianity-ophobia, it doesn't make any sense. There's anti-Christian sentiment. There's anti-Semitism. But you can't, there's no other term so there's no Islamophobia, there's no such thing as Islamophobia. I'm a practicing proud Muslim. It doesn't make any sense for me when people say Islamophobia. You can be anti certain races, and that's called racism, certain ethnicities, and that is also described as discrimination or racism, but you cannot be Islamophobic. You can have anti-Muslim views, which is a form of racism. It is also a form of hate speech, and it definitely has to be combated the same way we combat other ideologies. But I agree with you completely. Islamophobia is just it's a term that is often abused.
I agree with you completely, and I'm glad we agree on that. Mohamed Hineidi, really good to talk to you. Appreciate your time.